Along Panama's Caribbean coast, a loose community of sailors drifted between island anchorages, checking in with each other every morning on the radio, sharing weather reports, supply runs, happy hour invitations. But in January 2011, one of their own stopped answering. A well-liked American had vanished, his boat found drifting and blood-stained. Weeks later, divers near Portobello pulled a body from the water, but it wasn't him. It was a French yachtsman, shot in the head and tied to an anchor. Witnesses recalled seeing the same stranger aboard both boats. Shocked, the community began asking, who had they let aboard, and where was he now? Don North loved the simplicity of life at anchor. In his 50s, he had spent nearly 2 decades sailing the Caribbean on his modest sloop Wind Dancer. Panama's San Blas archipelago, known to its indigenous Guna people as Guna Yala, was one of his favorite refuges. Low sandy islands scattered across a sparkling sea, fringed with coconut palms and coral reefs. Don fit right into the easy rhythm of this place. He was friendly and generous with advice on the single sideband radio network that cruisers used to chat each morning. Other sailors knew his voice well, a helpful presence who always signed off with a weather tip or a joke. In the evenings, Don often joined beach potlucks and bonfires, sharing fresh-caught fish and stories under the stars. He wasn't just another drifter, he was part of the community fabric. And wherever Don dropped anchor, by his side would be Kuna, his tiny black Schipperke dog, scampering on deck or in the sand. In late 2010, Don had settled in around Chichime Island, a speck of land encircled by shallow reef. It was the kind of spot cruisers describe as paradise. Turquoise shallows so clear you could count starfish on the bottom, and gentle trade winds rustling the palms. But even in paradise, there were mundane realities. One was immigration. Don's visa was expiring, and to renew it, he needed to briefly leave Panama and return. A short sail to nearby Colombia and back would do the trick. As the new year of 2011 dawned, however, Don was in pain. On January 1st, he took a bad fall on the dock and injured his back. Hoisting sails and handling Wind Dancer solo would be risky. He needed a crewmate for the trip, someone capable and trustworthy. By chance, help was close at hand. Around the islands that season was a newcomer, a 42-year-old Spaniard named Javier Martín Bermejo. Martín was a fellow sailor who had recently suffered misfortune of his own. His vessel, a steel-hulled ketch called Twyla, had struck a reef and sunk just a few weeks earlier, on December 8, 2010. The shipwreck left him stranded and penniless in Guna Yala. With an air of quiet desperation, Martín had been hanging around anchorages and port towns, looking for work or a way out. To Don, ever helpful, perhaps sympathetic to a mariner's plight, Martín seemed like a godsend. Here was an able-bodied sailor eager to assist, fluent in Spanish for dealing with officials, and familiar with the local waters. Don hired Martín as a deckhand for the voyage to Colombia. He spoke of being a former chef from Valencia, reinventing himself as a sailor, although there was something opaque about the Spaniard's past. In the first days of January 2011, Wind Dancer weighed anchor from Chichime Island with Don, Kuna the dog, and Martín aboard. The plan was to sail southeast toward Colombia, get Don's passport stamped, and return within a couple of weeks. They motored out through the reef cut and were gone. It was the last time anyone in the San Blas community would see Don North alive. Days passed, then weeks. Normally, Don checked in daily on his radio. He was a fixture of the morning airwaves, so when his familiar call sign went silent, fellow sailors took note. At first, some assumed Wind Dancer had simply gone beyond transmission range or was delayed by weather. But unease grew when Don failed to appear at the next island gathering. It was highly unusual for Don to not be talking on the SSB radio, or to miss the beach happy hours, one cruising friend later remembered. By January 10th, 2011, concern turned to alarm. Don's family back in the States had not heard from him either. His nephew, Ezra North, tried emailing and calling local contacts, to no avail. Something was wrong. In Panama, only a family member could officially report a foreigner missing. Determined to find his uncle, Ezra North flew to Panama from Texas. Upon arriving, he stood before Panamanian press cameras and pleaded for help locating Don. Local authorities were notified, and an investigation began. Word spread quickly through the close-knit expat network. One of their own was missing at sea. Meanwhile, around that very same time, a separate disappearance was unfolding on the mainland. In the port town of Portobello, a place once famous for Spanish galleons and pirate raids, Jean-Pierre Bouahard had been looking to sell his yacht. At 62, Bouahard was an experienced French mariner who had spent years sailing the Caribbean. His pride and joy was the Levante, a 50-foot catamaran, broad, stable, and worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. In late January 2011, a prospective buyer appeared, a Spaniard, recently bereft of his own boat, who said he was eager to purchase a new one. Bouahard met Martin in Portobello's harbour and entertained his offer. But the negotiations didn't go far. Bouahard wanted $300,000 in cash for the Levante, whereas Martin proposed to pay in monthly installments. A sailor living by his wits, Martin simply didn't have the money. Bouahard firmly declined the installment plan, and the two parted ways. A few days later, Bouahard vanished. Neighbours noticed that Levante was gone from its mooring, and Bouahard, ordinarily seen each morning buying baguettes in the village, was nowhere to be found. It was as if man and boat had evaporated into the warm mist of Portobello Bay. But on February 4th, 2011, the ocean yielded a clue in horrific fashion. Divers from a local indigenous community surfaced near a spot known as One Rock, pulling behind them a tangled mass, the body of a man attached by ropes to a rusty anchor. The corpse had been in the water for over a week. Identification was difficult. But soon the French consulate confirmed the worst. It was Bouahard. His family provided dental records and DNA from his daughter, which helped Panamanian forensics match the remains to Bouahard. Examination showed he'd been shot in the head, execution style. Powder burns on what was left of his skin suggested the gun's muzzle was pressed against him when it fired. The anchor tied to his feet was meant to sink the body permanently, but a cruel twist of fate, or a knot hastily tied, had allowed the corpse to float to the surface. In a small community like Portobello, the news spread fast, and terrified whispers began. Murder had come to their tranquil waters. By early February, 2 international sailors, one American, one French, were missing under suspicious circumstances, and both had last been seen in the company of the same man. The Spanish drifter with the sun-bleached hair and unassuming smile, Martin, was quickly becoming the focus of dark speculation. It was more than a hunch. A group of over 40 cruisers and tourists living on their boats had already linked the events. They had seen Martin piloting the Levante alone shortly after Bouahard disappeared. Some had chatted with him as he sailed the big catamaran out of Portobello, heading east toward a marina in Puerto Lindo, notably without its French owner in sight. Others recalled that just weeks earlier, Martin had been camped on Chichime Island helping Don, only to return from a sailing trip without Don. The pattern was chilling and uncanny. On an online expat forum called Panama Guide, freelance investigator and blogger Don Winner sounded the alarm. He published an urgent warning about a potential serial killer targeting boaters along Panama's Caribbean coast. Winner, a former US intelligence officer turned journalist, had been contacted by Ezra North as the family scrambled for help. With Ezra feeding him details and local sailors corroborating sightings, Winner did what authorities hadn't yet. He publicly named Martin as the prime suspect in both the Bouahard murder and Don's disappearance. His posts in early February read like something out of a thriller. Wanted, Javier Martin, a Spanish sailor, suspected in at least 2 killings of fellow cruisers. He described Martin's boat wreck, his attempt to buy Bouahard's yacht, and the eerie fact that Don North's sloop had been found drifting near an island, ransacked and inexplicably repainted under a new name. The cruising community mobilized, relaying winners' bulletins via radio nets and Facebook groups. Strangers who shared only the bond of wanderlust in the sea came together, determined that a murderer would not slip away into the waves. Panamanian authorities were soon inundated with calls from embassies and worried sailors. The French consulate in Panama filed an official complaint implicating Martin in Bouahard's killing. The US Embassy and FBI liaisons also leaned in. After all, an American citizen was missing, possibly harmed. Facing international pressure, Panama formed a small task force of detectives, including members of its Judicial Investigations Directorate, and even an FBI advisor brought in by the North family. They knew they needed to find Martin urgently, not only to solve the crimes, but to prevent him from claiming any more victims. It did not take long to locate him. To the astonishment of many in the sailing circle, Martin was not in hiding at all in those first days of February. Boldly, almost brazenly, he had sailed Levante, the Frenchman's stolen catamaran, to a nearby marina and continued his routine. On February 2nd, 2011, police and a local magistrate finally summoned Martin for questioning in the town of Portobello. They found him in possession of a startling array of other people's property. He had Don's dinghy, the small motorboat tender that belonged to Wind Dancer, now painted a different colour. And through the fresh paint, investigators spotted a bullet hole piercing its hull. He also carried several of Don's personal items, including Don's own credit card and passport tucked in with Martin's gear. Moreover, Panama's Maritime Authority confirmed that a sailboat matching Wind Dancer had recently been re-registered under a new name and repainted green. Martin had rechristened Don's beloved home as the Green Twilight, a feeble attempt to disguise a vessel that every cruiser in San Blas would instantly recognize. The circumstantial evidence was piling up. Here was a man who last saw both victims, was caught with their boats and belongings, and was identified by witnesses as acting in their stead. He even had a handgun and a rifle among his possessions, and yet, crucially, no one had seen him pull a trigger. Don's body was still missing at sea. There was no direct witness to Bouahard's murder. Ballistics tests on the spot were not yet done. Panama's legal system, influenced by civil law traditions, required strong proof of a crime to hold a suspect. And in what would later be remembered as a serious blunder, Martin was interrogated and then released. It may be hard to fathom. The lead investigator in Portobello later explained that, at that moment, they only had a person of interest with stolen goods, enough to charge perhaps with theft, but not yet with homicide. So they let him walk free, hoping to gather more evidence for a later arrest. Martin, stone-faced and calm during questioning, left the police station and promptly vanished into the sticky heat of the Panamanian afternoon. The authorities' misstep almost allowed a killer to slip away for good. Freed from custody, Martin knew the walls were closing in. He had to get out of Panama fast, and he had a plan. If the sea was no longer safe for him, he would escape over land, through one of the most unforgiving jungles on the planet. His destination, Colombia, just beyond Panama's law, across the infamous Darien Gap. The Darien region is a dense wilderness of swamps, mountains, and rainforest that blocks road travel between Central and South America. It's a place crawling with venomous creatures and, at times, armed smugglers. In other words, it was the perfect hiding ground for a desperate fugitive. This was not unfamiliar territory for the Spaniard. Martin had spent years sailing the pirate-infested waters of the Darien Gap, earning a meager living running an unlicensed charter service that ferried backpackers between Panama and Colombia, skirting the law and the dangerous jungles where no roads exist. Charging budget travelers a few $100s each, Martin would captain small boats through the remote San Blas chain, providing an adventurous, if risky, alternative to flying between continents. Martin seemed comfortable in this near-lawless region, and himself exuded a dark energy that didn't go unnoticed. At various anchorages, he'd brawl or boast. One hostel owner remembered Martin's bizarre aggression towards animals. "That guy is a psychopath," she told investigators. "He caught a snake one time, cut its head off, and ran around shaking the snake everywhere." Now on the run, Martin headed south, traveling under assumed names, moving by bus and on foot toward the frontier. By February 14th, 2011, he had reached the little village of Santa Fe in Darien province. There, posing as a weary backpacker, he checked into a rustic guest house. He paid cash and even struck up a flirtatious conversation with the young receptionist, telling her he'd come from the islands and was looking for a horse to buy. The receptionist might have thought him eccentric, a foreigner on a quixotic jungle trek, but she accepted him as just another traveler. He signed the hotel ledger not as Javier Martin, but with another name, Don North. But in the coming hours, that alias would prove his undoing. Back in Panama City and Colón, police and volunteers were scrambling. The uproar from the sailing community had only grown after Martin's inexplicable release. Expat forums lit up with outrage, and families feared he would kill again if not stopped. Recognizing their error, Panamanian authorities quietly put out a nationwide alert with Martin's photograph. Television news ran segments on Valentine's Day, showing the Spaniard's face and warning that a dangerous suspect was on the run. Don Winner himself went on air to urge the public to help catch this man. He suspected Martin might try to melt into Panama's wild interior, and he was right. The question was whether anyone in those remote reaches would see the news in time. At a modest hotel near the edge of the Darien jungle, the clerk on duty that Valentine's Day evening happened to be watching. The report flashed across the TV. Wanted, Javier Martin, suspect in murders of 2 sailors. The photo was unmistakable. The clerk's heart pounded. She knew that face. It was the polite guest in room 27, the one who had just moments ago invited her to join him for a drink, saying, "It's Valentine's Day. I don't want to be alone tonight." Winner would later relay her shock. "You just learned that Don North is actually Javier Martin, an accused serial killer. And he's hitting on you." The young woman felt a surge of fear. Mustering courage, she excused herself and immediately phoned her boss, who alerted the police. "He's here. The man on the news. He's staying in our hotel," she whispered. Then all she could do was wait, hoping the dangerous guest upstairs wouldn't sense anything amiss. What followed felt like a scene from an action film. Units of Panama's elite border patrol, Senafront, were dispatched to Santa Fe in the dead of night. These were hardened jungle troops, trained to track fugitives and guerrillas in the rainforest. Under a moonless sky in the early hours of February 15th, they moved in quietly. Some officers surrounded a small farmhouse nearby where Martin's rented horses were stabled. Others crept toward the hotel. At around 1 a.m., the team breached room 27. Martin was caught utterly off guard. Perhaps he thought the jungle had shielded him, or perhaps he was asleep, dreaming of freedom. Either way, he did not resist. In that tiny room, police found the trappings of a man prepared for a long, illicit journey, over $13,000 in cash, much of it traced to Don's bank withdrawals, 3 firearms, including a .38 revolver, a Glock pistol, and a 16-gauge shotgun, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition, a satellite phone and GPS device, forged identification papers, Don's credit card and passport, and even the keys and registration documents for Levante, the Frenchman's catamaran. It was a trove of evidence as damning as any confession. Martin was armed to the teeth and carrying a fortune in stolen money, clearly planning to disappear into the wild. Had the clerk hesitated just a few minutes more, he might have slipped away on horseback into the trackless Darien Gap beyond the reach of law enforcement. But fate intervened on that Valentine's night. The so-called sailboat killer had been caught. With Martin securely in custody, Panama's justice system had a second chance to ensure he would face consequences. This time, they did not let him go. He was swiftly transported to a detention cell in Panama City, and officials publicly thanked the cooperative efforts that led to the arrest, not least the vigilance of an ordinary citizen who recognized a face from TV. Ezra North, who had been anxiously assisting police for weeks, breathed a sigh of relief when he got the call about the arrest. The search for his uncle, however, was far from over. Now came the painstaking task of gathering enough evidence to formally charge Martin with murder, 2 murders no less, and to find, if possible, Don's remains. Investigators immediately secured the key physical scenes connected to the crimes. The day after Martin's arrest, on February 16th, authorities finally located Don's missing sailboat. The Wind Dancer had been left abandoned near El Porvenir, a small port in the San Blas Islands where Panama's Cunha territory has an administrative outpost. Though Don's boat was adrift and stripped, it was intact, a floating time capsule of whatever happened on board. Crucially, the vessel had not been scuttled or burned, likely because Martin hoped to keep or sell it. Forensic technicians descended on Wind Dancer and treated it like a crime scene. What they found told a silent but vivid story. There were blood traces in the main cabin and along the companionway stairs leading up to the deck. DNA tests would later confirm the blood was Don North's. Spatter analysis indicated a gunshot wound in a confined space, a bullet likely fired into Don's head as he was below deck. Near the nav station, they recovered a deformed .22 caliber bullet lodged in wood paneling and spent 22 shell casings rolled in a corner. On the deck, more traces of blood suggested a body had been dragged out of the cabin and over the rail. There was very little question he was killed on his boat, Ezra North said quietly after seeing the evidence. Perhaps mercifully, the sea kept its secrets as to Don's final moments. His remains have never been found, lost to the depths or hidden by reefs and currents. At the same time, another forensic sweep was underway on Levante. Moored now at Puerto Lindo under custody, the bright yellow-trimmed yacht yielded its own clues. In one of its dinghies, investigators found additional .22 caliber shell casings. Ballistic experts noted that Buahard had been killed with a .22 rifle shot. This raised a tantalizing question. Where did that murder weapon come from? It turned out Don had owned a .22 caliber rifle on Wind Dancer, a common precaution for a sailor traveling in isolated areas. That rifle was missing from Don's boat, presumably taken by Martin. Now, with the bullet that killed Buahard recovered from the Frenchman's skull during autopsy, police could test a theory. They sent the bullet for comparison with Don's rifle once they found it among Martin's seized items. Before long, ballistics confirmed a match. The projectile that killed Buahard had been fired from Don's gun. In other words, Martin had murdered the Frenchman with the American's firearm, likely after killing Don and looting his arsenal. It was a gruesome link between the two crimes, a signature of a single perpetrator. Investigators didn't stop there. Back on tiny Chichime Island, the Guna guides helped police retrace Martin's steps. He had been seen camping on shore before the ill-fated trip with Don. Sure enough, hidden in a grove of mangroves, officers found 2 weather-beaten tents that Martin had left behind. Inside were stashed various possessions that had belonged to Don. Pieces of navigational equipment, a laptop, the SSB radio that Don used daily, and even one of Don's handguns. It seemed Martin had offloaded heavy or less needed loot from Wind Dancer to these tents, perhaps intending to retrieve it later. By late March 2011, only 6 weeks after the arrest, Panama's Auxiliary Prosecutor's Office felt confident it had a solid case. Lead prosecutor Dimas Guevara moved to formally indict Javier Martin for intentional homicide in the matter of Don North. Charging someone with murder when the victim's body is missing is always challenging, but Guevara pointed out that the sheer weight of evidence filled the void. Blood DNA, ballistics, stolen property, eyewitness accounts, all converging on Martin as Don's killer. The indictment described how Martin had repainted and renamed Don's boat, and how he'd been caught using Don's credit card and identity. Powerful indicators of motive and guilt. Simultaneously, authorities in Colon province named Martin as the prime suspect in Buahard's murder, an investigation that was progressing in parallel. For now, prosecutors held off on a separate murder charge for Buahard, focusing first on the North case, but the evidence was being carefully cross-referenced. As the legal machinery lumbered forward, Martin sat in Panama's notorious La Jolla prison under preventative detention. For a year or more, he rarely saw the outside of a courtroom or a cell. When interrogated, he maintained a cold innocence. He spun a tale that perhaps Don had fallen overboard accidentally, or that someone else must have killed Buahard after he left. Investigators didn't buy these stories for a second. But in the eyes of the law, Martin was still an alleged killer awaiting trial. During 2011 and 2012, forensic labs finished their analyses, witnesses provided sworn statements, and Panamanian officials coordinated with counterparts in the US and France. A court-ordered psychiatric evaluation examined Martin and declared him sane and fit to stand trial. No mental excuses would absolve his actions. By December 2011, Special Prosecutor Sofonor Espinosa, who took over the case, announced the investigation was essentially complete. All that remained was to assemble the mountain of proof for court and navigate Panama's sometimes slow judicial scheduling. Finally, after a series of procedural delays, the day of reckoning arrived in the spring of 2014. On April 15th, in a Panama City courthouse, the trial of Javier Martín Bermejo opened before the Second Superior Tribunal. In Panama, serious crimes like murder are often heard by a panel of judges rather than a jury, and this case was no exception. 2 judges presided. Martin, now 45 years old, stood formally accused of 2 counts of aggravated homicide, as well as related charges of theft, illegal weapons possession, and identity fraud. Clad in prison garb, he pleaded not guilty to everything except the firearms charge, which he couldn't deny given the arsenal found on him. His demeanor was described by observers as impassive, even smug. He had spent 3 years in custody at that point, and perhaps believed the evidence might not all hold up in court. If so, he gravely misjudged. Prosecutor Sofonor Espinosa methodically laid out the case over 2 days of testimony. Crucially, multiple eyewitnesses took the stand to cement the narrative. Several fellow cruisers testified that Martin was the last person seen with each victim. One had watched Don and Martin sail off together from Chichime. Another had seen Martin steering Levante alone and wondered where the French owner was. A Guna diver recounted discovering Bouahard's body and noted the unusual anchor tied to his legs, which matched an anchor missing from Bouahard's own boat. Ezra North spoke, giving a moving timeline of how completely out of character his uncle's disappearance was, and how that prompted the family's urgent search. He described stepping aboard Wind Dancer after it was found and being struck by the bloodstains still visible in the cabin, a sight that confirmed to him that his Uncle Don had met a brutal end there. "No one deserves to die like that," one of Don's close friends, choking back emotion, told the court. Perhaps the most colourful witness was Don Winner, the blogger detective who had helped break the case open. He testified about the Panama Guide postings, explaining how the sailing community's reports convinced him that a dangerous predator on the seas was at work, and how publicizing Martin's face led directly to the tip that got him caught. Winner also shed light on motive. Why did Martin do it? Winner echoed what the evidence suggested. After losing his own boat and livelihood, Martin was desperate to acquire new vessels and gear by any means necessary. Don's smaller sloop provided equipment and money for short-term gain. Bouahard's large catamaran was the real prize, capable of carrying many paying passengers for the lucrative backpacker ferry route between Panama and Colombia. He wanted a big boat that could carry more passengers, Winner explained, outlining how Martin stood to charge $450 per backpacker for island-hopping trips. Martin's boat was gone, so he set out to steal someone else's, and was willing to kill for it. The defense had little to work with, but they tried nonetheless. Martin's attorney, Elvis Atencio, did his best to sow doubt. He pointed out that Don's body was never found. Could they be sure he was truly dead? Perhaps Don had an accident at sea. Perhaps someone else attacked Bouahard after Martin left Portobello. These suggestions rang hollow against the wealth of evidence, but the defense also offered character witnesses in an attempt at mitigation. One man testified that Martin had talked of starting a legitimate charter business and had shown good conduct in prison. A Colombian acquaintance, Jorge Navas, claimed Martin frequently visited his dock in Sapsuro, a border village, and never showed aggression, describing him as a helpful person who even looked into buying land for a business venture. In a rather transparently irrelevant swipe, Navas also remarked that Don was not a very sociable person, as if to suggest that maybe Don simply sailed off without telling anyone. None of these defense narratives held water. The cold fact spoke louder. Blood, bullets, and stolen boats drew a straight line to Martin. After 2 days of proceedings, the judges retired to deliberate. On April 16, 2014, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Martin was convicted of the willful murder of Ronald Don North and of Bouahard, as well as the associated crimes. In their written judgment, the tribunal highlighted the cruel premeditation evident in Martin's actions. He had abused the trust of friendly sailors, carried out 2 killings in cold blood, and gone to elaborate lengths to profit from the crimes, repainting vessels, faking documents, attempting flight. This, the judges noted, was a rare case of a serial murderer operating within Panama's usually peaceful maritime community. Later that year, the court pronounced sentence. For each of the 2 murders, Martin received 26 years in prison, the high end of Panama's penalty range for homicide. These terms were ordered to be served consecutively, back-to-back, for a total of 52 years behind bars. Additionally, a few shorter sentences were added for the weapons and fraud charges. But effectively, they made little difference next to the colossal double life term. 52 years is, in Panamanian practice, essentially a life sentence. By law, the maximum time an inmate can actually serve is often capped, at 50 years typically. But either way, Martin would be an elderly man in his 80s before release could be considered. When the sentence was read, Martin reportedly showed no remorse or emotion. He still insisted he was innocent, a stance he would carry futilely through appeals. Indeed, Martin did appeal. His lawyers filed motions in 2015, alleging technical failures in the evidence chain, and arguing that since he was once released in February 2011 for lack of evidence, the case should be viewed as weak. These arguments went nowhere. In November 2015, Panama's Second Superior Tribunal upheld the conviction and sentence, finding no fault in the trial's conduct or conclusions. A final appeal to the Supreme Court's penal chamber was resolved in 2017, again affirming that Martin was guilty as charged and that his 52-year punishment stood. Justice, as far as the system was concerned, was done. In Panama, the story had captivated the public from the moment Martin went on the run. Newspapers dubbed him El Asesino del Velero, the sailboat killer, and drew uncomfortable parallels to another expat murderer who had been caught the year before. Just a year prior, an American named Wild Bill Holbert was arrested for murdering 5 fellow expatriates in Panama's Bocas del Toro region. To have another foreigner committing serial killings so soon sent a chill through tourist communities. Panamanian media didn't shy away from the comparison, though the crimes were unrelated. One heartening aspect amidst this darkness was the way the sailing community and local Panamanians came together. What began as a frightening mystery evolved into a story of solidarity. In the San Blas Islands, Guna fishermen and Western expatriates alike volunteered in the search efforts. Many were heartbroken that Don's kindness had been repaid with treachery. In a poignant online tribute, a cruiser recounted how they finally held a memorial for Don in 2012, once it was clear he would not be coming back. A flotilla of dinghies gathered off Chichime Island at sunset. Jean-Pierre Bouahard, too, was remembered by the Portobello community. In the years after his conviction, Martin faded from the news, languishing in prison. Occasionally, rumors surfaced of other unsolved cases possibly linked to him. A sailor lost in the Venezuelan islands here, a missing boat in Guatemala there, but no concrete evidence ever emerged to tie him to more crimes. As of today, Javier Martin remains behind bars in Panama, serving out his 52-year sentence, and he will likely die in prison, far from the sunlit waters where he once charmed his way aboard trusting sailors' boats. Thanks so much for listening. If you're interested in rarely heard solved global murder cases, consider giving us a follow. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd be thrilled if you would give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. It really helps us a lot. See you next time.